I would rather have an AI solution that fits perfectly with my workflow at the cost of some loss in accuracy than having an AI solution that lives on paper with 100% accuracy, but that does not adjust to my workflow and that takes me away from all that I'm doing, forces me to log into other things, or is not inserted in the right decision point at the time of that decision point that is needed. So this is the kind of thing that gets the vendors to be successful or not, and not just the sheer accuracy.
Welcome to Frame by Frame, Rethink Imaging, a podcast by Imalogics. Here, we explore the intricate world of medical imaging, aiming to dissect the field and inspire both professionals and curious minds alike. I'm your host, Chris St. John. Welcome back to Frame by Frame, Rethink Imaging. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Leonardo Bittencourt, the Vice Chair of Innovation at University Hospitals Cleveland and a leader of Radiology, the Radiology, AI, and Diagnostic Innovation Collaborative. Dr. Bittencourt brings a unique perspective. Having spent about 11 years at DASA, Brazil's largest diagnostic company, before transitioning to academic medicine, where he's been pioneering AI validation partnerships with startups worldwide. Under his leadership, Radiology has successfully partnered with companies like AZMED to achieve FDA approval for AI tools, demonstrating improvements in diagnostic accuracy and workflow efficiency. Today, we're going to explore his straight-to-the-point approach to AI implementation, discuss practical strategies for departments looking to adopt AI, and get his insights on navigating this massive landscape of AI applications. Dr. Bittencourt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to the Frame by Frame podcast for the kind invitations. It's going to be an honor.
Thank you so much. And so just before we dive too far in, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit. You spent 11 years at DASA, which I think is like Diagnósticos de Sudamérica.
It's now a made-up word. DASA is now a word, but it was initially created as Diagnostics of America, Inc. The SA is the Inc. termination in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Then you joined University Hospitals Cleveland. What drew you from the commercial environment to an academic medical center?
Well, thank you for this question. So just to give you an idea of what DASA is about, DASA is the leader in diagnostic medicine in Latin America, probably one of the leaders in the world in numbers of exams processed. And diagnostic medicine means imaging, labs, pathology, and some other types of imaging diagnostics. Last time I heard they had over 170 MRI scanners throughout the country of Brazil. There are many countries that don't have those numbers of scanners. Brazil has other major players in diagnostic medicine and in hospitals. It's a market in consolidation, both the hospital, health systems, and diagnostics. So DASA is the leader in diagnostic medicine and one of the leaders in hospital and health systems. And I worked there for over a decade. There have been series of mergers that further consolidated DASA. And they had a footprint of investing in innovation and created very early on a hub developing and internalizing AI applications and implementing digital solutions to their platforms. And by doing so, they invited some of their physicians and practitioners to join as clinical champions and project leaders in some of those projects. And I was fortunate to be among one of those clinical champions and project leaders in some of those projects. That's how my journey in innovation not only began, but became more mature. And we were exposed suddenly to a community of geniuses that were surrounding us there that the company brought in. And they brought us into the headquarters to interact with the IT teams, with the data scientists, with the developers, with the marketing department. So we got an understanding of product development, revenue cycle, clinical usefulness, things that are not always part of the clinical training of a radiologist. And by the way, I'm an abdominal radiologist by training. I research around prostate MRI, my focus of research and advanced MRI for genitourinary conditions. But in that capacity, I was also serving as a clinical champion and project leader in some of those digital transformation and AI projects. And that's the DASA part, right? And then you asked how was the transition to academic medicine. So in Brazil, it is also common that who have some kind of academic background, they can apply for part-time government positions in academic institutions. Most of the universities in Brazil are government-owned, the ones that do research, and they are public. So I had a part-time appointment at one of the federal universities in Brazil, and I was always involved with research since the beginning of my career there. So it's not that it was a very harsh transition from private to academic, because I was always an academic radiologist practicing academic radiology in a private practice too. And DASA invested a lot in our academic development, which was what got me connected with university hospitals and Case Western Reserve University in the first place. Because one of the things that the company would do there would be to invite people from all over the world that was doing exciting and innovative research to come in and give talks to the people in Brazil and to the community in Brazil. And it was in one of those talks that they invited one of my mentors, Dr. Mark Griswold, who is here at the Case Western Reserve University, to give a talk on a groundbreaking MRI technique that was developed here, that we got connected in the first place. And that research that we did together resulted in a continued collaboration that later on led to their invitation for me to apply for the position here.
Right. And the position that you applied for that you currently hold, right? It's the Vice Chair of Innovation, which I've heard of a lot of fun titles. I have not heard that one in too many places. And I feel like you're in a relatively unique position, right? Like most departments don't have a standalone innovation role. How do you think leadership deemed that this was necessary? And like, what does your day-to-day actually look like in an innovation role?
This is at the same time an exciting title and position to have, but also a very scary and intimidating one, right?
Right.
Because when people hear it from the first time, they think, oh my God, that's nice. Someone thinking about innovation and innovation individually, because many departments, they have informatics and innovation or research and innovation, but innovation alone, right? Also exciting. Then they have someone looking at innovation, but then it's almost always followed by, okay, but then what does innovation do that the others are not doing? And that was my
right.
And interestingly, it also had to do with the way that I was recruited. When the department approached me to see if I would be interested in pursuing a position here, initially, their interest was in filling a spot that had more to do with MRI research. And there was a whole effort in advancing the staffing and the faculty in MRI research here. And because of our collaboration, they felt, hey, why don't you consider applying? Because we had a very successful engagement with you, and you may be a person to fill in that position. And when I came in and they learned about what I was doing over the last 5 years, not just I was doing, but what I was exposed to in my work environment, and all the innovation that was transpiring there in not only in DASA, but I would say in the whole of Brazil healthcare. They got very intrigued and interested in that. And that at the very last minute when I got my offer, the scope was broadened to innovation. So it was something that was built together during the process of my interviews and my recruitment here, that I think it was a bold and very clever and very fortunate move from my leadership to look ahead and to envision that idea of supporting innovation in an academic department. And I think I hope to them, right, that it paid out so far and that this was a very successful idea that they had. And I'm really grateful that this opportunity came up.
Yeah. And so you are the Vice Chair of Innovation, and you also run Radically. So not radically. For our listeners who cannot hear the difference, RADICLE, not radically. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about your Radically initiative?
Sure. And it has everything to do with this question that, hey, Vice Chair of Innovation, so what?
Right.
Right. And when I joined in here, it was during COVID. So imagine doing innovation without the ability to meet people, to be in the same space and have random conversations. So all I had to do was to accept all meeting invitations that I got, all the cold calls that popped up on LinkedIn, and to try and schedule intentionally time with my colleagues around the department and learn better of their needs, their expectations, and what is it that I could do to help develop an atmosphere of innovation in the department. And people had all kinds of comments like, hey, I'm a researcher, so I am an innovator. That's true up to a certain point, right? And someone else said, hey, I do informatics. And innovation should be informatics because this is all that innovation is about. So the first thing I noticed is that what is it that makes innovation something unique that deserves its own leadership or governance, right? But at the same time, respecting all the overwhelming overlaps that innovation has with all the neighboring areas, because there's no way that you can do innovation without doing research, without relying on informatics, without relying on product development, marketing, legal, compliance, and everything, right? So what is it that makes it innovation, but at the same time, how can we foster an atmosphere of collaboration that we bring together everybody with their contributions? And the answer came from one of those cold calls, right? You mentioned AZMED, and AZMED is a startup from France that they were doing well there already in AI detection of fractures on X-rays. And they called me, they asked for those 15-minute calls. And the call was initially to gauge our interest in all those projects. They cost so much in internal efforts, in all the approvals that are necessary, that by the time you reach the 3-month mark, it's already gone and you won't be able to experience that well, right? So we were not that inclined to accepting free trials at the time, but because I really much valued the conversations we were having, they were very transparent and frank. I was made aware that they were not yet cleared on FDA, and they would be looking for a partner for their studies that were needed for their regulatory pathway. And I said, you know what? This can turn into an interesting concept for us to walk around what is innovation in our department, right? So what if we create a process or a program that helps the companies in a more structured way, not as a standalone, not as a one and done, as many departments are already doing, but in a structured way to get the types of data that they need for the studies, but also to create around it a community of clinical champions and of practitioners, data annotators, data reviewers that can surround the study with all the academic oversight and partnership and get those companies to their commercial development, but also to create a long-standing academic relationship that will revert into a virtuous cycle in that, well, there will be some revenue to be made out of it that can revert into grant money to fund some of my faculty colleagues' time to dedicate to research. And that will expose them to more research and to more opportunities to get exposed to AI. And they will become clinical champions and key opinion leaders themselves, right? And that will be a critical mass that will only grow. And suddenly, our mission in disseminating what is innovation will be fulfilled by this aura of awareness.
Yeah. And so can you walk us through a little bit how Radically actually works, right? Like when you started working with AZMED, what does the process look like from like an initial evaluation to potentially all the way through FDA approval?
So again, any listener from any academic department, first they would think, well, but we all do that. Every academic department, we have our people who get data for research. We have our informatics team. We have data requests, right? This is what everybody does. And I agree, this is what everybody does. But I think that what makes not only Radically, but there are other initiatives in other academic departments that are going in the same way. And some of those were even our inspiration first started discussing, but we try to bring it up at scale and with an intent to use it to support industry academic collaborations without aiming only for those big multi-million grants, but for the small, everyday, small micro grants or micro deals that will create a sense of continuity and will create a sense of a hub, of a landing zone for the industry and for our faculty to huddle around. I think that the immaterial concept is probably more unique than what we do at the end of the day, which is to select data, package data, ship data, and expertise and research oversight and conduct research together, right? But it's much more the understanding that this will be hopefully a self-sustaining virtuous cycle that will foster collaboration with the industry and expose our faculty to those opportunities.
To pivot a little bit, we had a little phone call a little while back before recording the episode. One of the things we were talking about on the phone was you mentioned that you prefer, when assessing AI tools, 100% workflow integration with about 80% accuracy versus the flip of that, right? Like 80% workflow with 100% accuracy. Can you explain to me a little bit more what you meant by that and maybe give us like a little bit of an example?
Sure. And this has to do with the other end of our innovation journey, right? So Radically lives much more on the co-development, the validation part of the early stage or the pre-regulatory or the pre-clinical AI tools. But we try to participate in the department also in other parts of the journey of AI. And now your question has to do with the clinical implementation of AI of commercial solutions. And we do have a whole arsenal of clinical AI tools that are being used today in our department, and they came through different routes, right? And I would say, and this is for your listeners that are in the industry, most of those that we have today that are clinically implemented, they came through some kind of successful research collaboration or co-development collaboration. There are very few that came through a sales pitch, right? So this is one thing that tells. And it's also worth mentioning that given my role in innovation, I participate on everything related to AI, but when it comes to clinical implementation and the decision to clinically adopt a solution, the real decisors, they come into play. So the operations teams, the department leadership, corporate budgeting, the division heads or the clinical division heads, all those people, they will come into play. And this is not my decision or my realm anymore, right? So innovation has to do with empowering their decisions and offering the data that we gather together. And along this journey of clinical AI implementation, it is very common that we get emails from people all over the institution and executives, even outside of radiology, and they email the front page or the headline of the last article that came out. And it's the typical thing like AI was better than radiologists in fill in the blanks, right? You may get those every day, right?
Yes.
And your listeners may get those every day. AI is better than radiologists and everything. There was even one that pigeon were better than radiology reading mammograms. Come on, right? But if you go past the headline, the overwhelming majority of those publications, they will be related to a study with a narrow question in a controlled environment with a selected data set and in a way that does not replicate or emulate the clinical workflow. And it's made to prove a point, right? This is how science is. It's made to prove a hypothesis. But the way you construct the study design doesn't necessarily reflect on the same way that the clinical teams are going to be using the tool down the line. So there are other studies that are very well designed. They try to emulate that, and they should be valued. But what happens is that those published papers, they become tools that are used by the sales teams to start pitching accuracy performance. But when you take the product out of the box to implement in a health system, that accuracy, for a whole number of reasons, but I would say workflow, probably the biggest of them, be measured the same way. So when I say I'd rather have 100% workflow, and this statement is not mine, it's from one of my brilliant colleagues, a division head here of cardiothoracic imaging, Dr. Amit Gupta. I use it all the time because I agree with that so much, is that I would rather have an AI solution that fits perfectly with my workflow at the cost of some loss in accuracy than having an AI solution that lives on paper with 100% accuracy, but that does not adjust to my workflow and that takes me away from all that I'm doing, forces me to log into other things, or is not inserted in the right decision point at the time of that decision point that is needed. So this is the kind of thing that gets the vendors to be successful or not, and not just the sheer accuracy. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It leads me to a follow-up question in my mind, which is, okay, so let's say I'm looking to assess some sort of AI tool to implement clinically. Like, how do you even begin to assess the workflow side of these tools, right? Like, I feel like it's so easy to quantify the success rate of an AI diagnostic tool, but how do you assess the workflow and how it's going to fit in?
So I'm going to give you an example. And again, it's not based on reality. It's an example, but it may likely be true to many, right? So imagine you have a vendor that is able to deal with a condition on X-rays from patients presenting to an emergency department. So they are able to detect something on X-rays of certain types of patients presenting to the emergency department. They come to us and they say, we are able to decrease the reading time of a radiologist by X, say 40%. So this should justify your purchase of this AI tool, because by doing that, your radiologist will be able to read that amount of exams more, and that will generate that amount of revenue more. So they start making linear assumptions based on that one number of 40% reduction in time, that their marginal cost is going to be less than the average time that the radiologist gets to read. That doesn't solve the equation, because the problem is not that X-ray and that use case that the radiologist will be reading or not. Because for one, the ED has all kinds of patients. And if it doesn't reduce the wait time on the ED, or if it doesn't let the emergency department take care of more patients in a better way, in a more structured way, or discharge better the patients, right? You're not solving a problem. You are solving a narrow use case and providing marginal results to a much more complex workflow and process, where this condition is only a small marginal part. And the radiologist that is reading those X-rays, the radiologist is probably reading CTs as well, or ultrasound as well, or MRIs as well. So the fact that you're influencing that small point in a heavily matrixed process, it doesn't mean that your product is going to be a game changer in anything. So when we were presented with similar solutions and with similar proposals, what we had to do then was to internalize their value proposition and say, hey, this does not solve a problem. We need to figure out what is the outcome that this use case is influencing and try to map it within our own reality, because there's no single solution, single workflow that works for everyone, right? In our own reality, to map our own process on how our emergency departments work. How is it that this decision is going to affect the length of stay of a patient, and try to map out the contribution of having or not having this tool in affecting the performance of the emergency department. So as you notice, it's not about accuracy anymore. Accuracy is just like one point that you have to consider, but also how is the information presented, or how is the timing that it goes? How much time does it take to process that AI? And how is it communicated down the line? And how is it that the communication affects the downstream actions that will affect the length of stay of the patient, if you decide that length of stay is a KPI, right? And that introduces even more complexity to assessing the value and the cost, and who's paying for the cost of AI in radiology, because more and more the vendors that are ahead in the game, they understand that radiology is utilizing and radiology is leading the deployment and usage of AI tools in radiology, but the effects are much more felt outside of radiology than inside.
Right. And we don't have to leave this in if you don't like the answer, you don't have a good answer, but like, where would you say the effects are being felt the most?
Well, the effects are being felt the most so far in the hyperacute setting. So disease like stroke, pulmonary embolism, aortic dissection, usually in the vascular, neurovascular settings, which are the decisions that are very much timed and that every minute counts. And the effects are much more felt, not because of the AI piece individually, but because of the whole framework of AI-powered results leading to a more timely decision, or wet report, wet read, or early communication by the radiologist to the care team, and a whole communication strategy to activate the care teams and offer them all the information to empower their treatment. So the most successful and the solutions that people are willing to pay right now They are solving the problem and they are not just giving an answer.
Yeah, interesting. And so for departments looking to implement AI solution, what is your take on individual point solutions versus more comprehensive platforms? And are there like business implications to that, workflow implications to that?
I think I spoke about that once, and I still have the same opinion. For departments willing to implement AI solutions, that's the first question they want to make. Why are we willing to implement AI solutions? There are departments that have a true need. And they say, hey, we are not doing well on stroke, or we are understaffed, or we are not meeting our SLAs, or there's some use case that was very well mapped and that justifies the adoption of a certain AI solution that has been proved to that use case. That's one way. But there are also departments that say, hey, everybody's doing AI. We should be doing AI. We should be looking at it. Let's put some money on it and see how it goes, right? And there are departments, and I think that ours is part of that have a track record of research and collaborations and being always immersed in an innovation environment that naturally the good things will trickle in and we'll have the maturity to assess what's worth doing, what's not, and can certainly differentiate what they're doing that is exploratory as opposed to full clinical, right? So I think probably there are more variations of decisions on how to adopt AI. I would say that the first one that has a use case, they should do an RSD and they should evaluate the vendors, right? The same way as if they were buying a PACS or a scanner, because ultimately it is a point solution for an existing problem. They should deal with that commercially and that's it. For the ones that want to experiment AI, I would say that a platform would be a good way if you have some money to spend, because most of the platforms, and I will elaborate on what's a platform, but most of the platforms, they allow you to try before you buy. And they even offer more than one vendor for the same type of use case. So you can also adapt and adjust the vendor to the kind of use case that you find useful. So just for your listeners, again, what we mean by standalone and platform solutions, right? It's probably that's what you asked too. So standalone solutions would be the ones that a vendor offers you in a very simplified way, and you implement it straight on your information systems, or namely your PACS or your RIS or electronic medical record, right? But you do all the effort of implementing that solution from that vendor into your information systems, and you manage the relationship, you manage the contracts, maintenance, and everything. Whereas a platform, and there are tons of platforms, you can think of it as an app store that is a software in itself, is a platform in itself, that you contract with the platform, and the platform is one connection to your information systems, and the platform hosts a number of third-party or their own AI solutions that you can turn on and off based on their business models. And usually they are the ones that manage the relationships with the third parties, so that you only have to focus on managing the relationship and everything related to the platform. There are pros and cons to each approach, but I would say that if you are not in the business of creating collaborations, of investing in research, and you don't have the bandwidth to manage individual relationships, right? Platforms are usually a way to go.
Okay. For our last little section, is there anywhere that you would prefer that we focus on? Do you want to talk about the business side with AZMED? Do you want to talk about the Clinical Champions Council approach? Do you want to talk about like practical advice?
I think whatever you feel like, whatever you think would be more intriguing. We can do philosophy, futurology, whatever you feel is more intriguing.
I mean, I don't have a question prepared when it comes to philosophy or futurology, and we were maybe going to cut that section out where I was giving Dr. Bittencourt the agency to choose how we finished our conversation today, but now I'm just curious. And so what exactly did you have in mind when you were talking about futurology just a second ago?
Yeah, I think that everything innovation, AI is an ever-changing field. Like discomfort is the norm in our field, right? And you can never reach a comfort zone because you won't be innovating. You need to be challenged the whole time. And right now that we're starting to get used and we're starting to try and create some sense of clinical adoption of AI, how to use, how to measure AI, and it's reaching the C-suite people now. People are trying to make sense. Then we start to get new revolutions coming from within the field of AI. All of the talks around large language models, foundation models, and fine-tuned models and all of that, I think this is going to radically change again the scene, right? I think that's what I meant by futurology. I think that we cannot afford anymore to get used to something because it's changed by the time we figured it out. And I think the new revolution is coming again. And the impact is already being felt on almost every health system now with the coming of the ChatGPT likes and all the large language models and their incorporation into different aspects of the practice of medicine. And it won't be different for radiology. It won't be different for how we will create, how we will deploy, how we will operate, and how we will measure the new AI solutions for the practice of radiology. So I think that's what I meant by futurology. And I think there's more to be said about that.
Yeah, and maybe this is like too futurist brained, but I hear that and I wonder to myself, right? The exponential increase in efficacy of these models and how it relates to like models helping build models, helping shape and train models. There's a part of hesitation on my side, like, are we going to be able to keep up?
Yeah.
Is that crazy?
Yeah. It is crazy. It is crazy. So in full disclosure, I'm not a computer science person, right? I'm a simple radiologist that had the chance to be exposed to innovation. So I like to think that I live on the border where I see the computer people from one side. And what I think that I can do is to translate things back and forth. So whatever I'm saying here is not coming from a point of technical expertise, but from what I understand from the conversations that I've been hearing. And let me elaborate on it. So you have, let's say again, ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, whatever large language model you have, right? And I'm sure all your listeners, they use it too. So they're generally very good for most things. But if you want to go to a more niche, more nuanced setting or domain, you will need one of those wrappers, one of those dedicated large language models that are coming out as individual products, right? We may call them downstream models, or we may call them wrappers, right? But they are enriched with data and with constraints and with conditions that improve their performance for specific areas. And it's not different in health, right? Most of those applications that we have today, not we, but people outside of radiology, they have today for ambient listening, summarizing of charts and all that, they have to do with fine-tuning and improvements on large language models. And what's happening in radiology is that a handful of companies and an ever-growing handful of companies, they are now starting to invest in radiology-specific large language models, which they call foundation models. Essentially, they would be based on millions and millions and millions of combinations of exams and their reports. That's my understanding, my translation. It's not technical terms. But they will come up with an ontology or with an idiom, a language that represents the understanding of those millions and millions of exams that will be able to out of the gate answer to most of the questions. But let's say that you want to be the best in detection of lung nodules. So what you can do now is to offer it a subfraction of new data of lung nodules that will fine-tune that foundation model. But that small amount of new data for lung nodules for fine-tuning is much smaller and less demanding than what we need today to train a whole model of lung nodules. So the result will be that will exponentialize the ability of the industry to create new models for new use cases, for new conditions that will go even beyond radiology, and they may incorporate lab values, chart values, so things that affect beyond the immediate diagnostic setting of radiology. But then, because it's futurology, right, you have to think ahead. if it is too easy, and I have been in touch with some of those companies that are developing foundation models, and it's such an exciting field. The point that I make to them is if it's becoming too easy for the industry to create and fine-tune new downstream models, so why is it that I, as a user, I'm going to be paying for your models if I can create my own inside my institution with my own population based on a subscription of a foundation model? So what I believe is that, and I don't know if this will hold true or not, but what I believe is that the next revolution will challenge our current business models that are not even mature yet.
Yeah, that's crazy. Dr. Bittencourt, we have to wrap up our interview today. But before I let you go, I'm just curious, now that we're on this futurist thread, is there like a specific breakthrough in AI or machine learning, specifically in radiology, that you are proactively waiting for or particularly excited about?
Excited, we have to be excited because if it comes to the betterment of our patients, right, it is something better for humanity. But everybody's always afraid. And afraid because this may take many people out of business, right? Imagine if you solve the tasks that you pay thousands of people for, right? So every line of business, every profession is suffering with this dilemma. Other professions, other specialties are more at risk first than radiology. So for the listeners who are worried about the future, I would say if we become obsolete and if we become not valuable anymore, it means that the whole world has become obsolete and not valuable before radiology, right? So everything goes together. But I would say that the major breakthroughs would be to be shown if the foundation models and the large language models, especially when they work together in a multimodal approach, imaging, text, pathology, everything all together, billing, right? Everything all together, they can start solving more complex questions on a system level and start truly decreasing costs to patients, improving outcomes significantly, and showing the true evidence for questions that people don't have.
Well, that is all the time we have today on Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging. Dr. Leonardo Bittencourt is the Vice Chair of Innovation at University Hospitals Cleveland and the leader of Radically. Dr. Bittencourt, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Chris, and the listeners.
Thank you. Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging is brought to you by Imalogics. Here, you'll find engaging interviews with thought leaders, experts, and patients, sharing stories that showcase the transformative power of medical imaging. To discover how Imalogics is rethinking imaging in healthcare, visit imalogics.com. Be sure to subscribe to Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And from all of us here at Imalogics, thanks for tuning in.